What is the number one fear of every practicing herbalist? Well, I would say it is probably the fear of doing harm to someone that you're trying to help when you give them plants. And I would say probably second in line is that the herbs that we give to someone simply don't work. And when we consider someone that is taking 1, 2, 10, 20 pharmaceutical medications, the risk of harming someone with the plants that we give them drastically increases. Or does it? I'm Sage Apop, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and I want to talk today about herb-drug interactions. Is it a fact? Is it fiction? Or is it really somewhere in between? I think this is a really important area of discussion because, a lot of people these days are taking prescription drugs, and there's a lot of prescription drugs out there, and some people are taking a lot of them. And I think there can be this really big fear as herbalists, or maybe not fear, but at the very least intimidation of giving someone medicinal plants when they are taking prescription or sometimes even over-the-counter medication. But I would say the prescription ones are a little bit more, edgy, I think, for most herbalists. But is that fear warranted, right? Like, do we really have to be overly cautious, overly paranoid when someone is taking pharmaceutical drugs and we want to give them herbs? So I want to talk about this topic of herb-drug interactions. It's something I get asked all the time by my students and just by people in the herbal community. So what's an herb-drug interaction? Well, the idea here is that when someone is taking a medication and they introduce herbal remedies, that there will be some sort of way in which the chemistry or the properties of the herbs influence or affect that drug they're taking, typically in a negative way, right? We usually think of herb-drug interactions as being negative. And that's, of course, kind of what we want to be aware of, but the truth is that there's also positive interactions actually between herbs and drugs that we'll talk about a little bit here. So there's a few different ways that we can see plants interacting with more conventional medications. The first one is what I like to think of as synergistic interactions. And this is essentially, or we can think of it as like an additive action or interaction, which is where essentially the herb is doing a very similar thing that the drug is doing, and so it accentuates the action of that drug. So that could be, sometimes that can be beneficial, sometimes that can be detrimental. So for example, someone might be taking blood pressure medication and they want to introduce an herb that also might lower blood pressure. Say maybe they want to introduce standardized ginkgo extract. Well, that can drop blood pressure a little bit. And obviously we don't want to drop people's blood pressure too low. So that's something that we need to be aware of. Sometimes people are taking, maybe something like cyclobenzaprine as a muscle relaxant, and we want to give them some herbal antispasmodics and nervine hypnotics, like for pain management. Well, that can be an additive effect where they're getting an additional layer of musculoskeletal relaxation. And it's just helping the drug do what it's doing and can make it more effective. And in some cases, might be able to make it so that the person can, drop their dosage of the prescription medication. Of course, this is never something that we tell people to do, right? Like exclamation point, bold, underlined, italics, like do not ever tell people, just take less of your drug, or, oh, you don't need to take the drug because here's your herbs. Like, don't do that. That's like where, as herbalists, that's where we have to be very careful. You don't ever tinker with, a doctor's prescription and their recommendations for people. But what we find is that this type of interaction, the synergistic interaction, is where the herbs are in a way supporting the effect of the drug. again, which can maybe make that drug overly effective to the point where it can cause a problem, like it tilts the scales in too far in one direction. But it can also be one where if that person is in communication with their doctor and their doctor's on board, perhaps they can introduce a weaning schedule to help drop their drugs down. I actually recently had this happen. I was working with a client that has, metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, and they talked to their doctor about wanting to, introduce some herbs. Doctor said, cool, which is amazing. And so I gave them a formula, and they were working with their doctor and really keeping on top of checking their blood sugar levels. And they were able to cut their dose of metformin in half. They were able to cut their dose of insulin in half just by introducing an herbal formula. Within 3 to 4 weeks, this started happening, and the doctor was actually really excited about it and really encouraging of the client, which is like, hallelujah, like a really amazing moment, because doctors don't always respond in that way. And the client was really, really happy because, according to their doctor, they're going to be able to wean off insulin if they keep up with the way their numbers are looking. Plus, there's all these added benefits of like, their triglycerides started going down, and their LDL cholesterol started going down, and their hemoglobin A1C is looking better, like all this stuff. So this is what I like to think of as a synergistic interaction. Another really interesting example of this is our berberine-containing plants, Oregon grape, Coptis, golden seal, those herbs that have that, yellow pigmented berberine alkaloids. There's been studies showing that, now granted the studies were on pure berberine sulfate, but they enhance the efficacy of antibiotics. Like people take antibiotics and the antibiotics don't work against that bacteria, probably because they developed a degree of resistance. They take that antibiotic alongside berberine, and the antibiotic becomes more effective. Not to mention berberine also has its own, antibiotic properties alongside with it, but that's what I tend to think of as a synergistic type reaction. We have another herb-drug interaction that I think of as protection interactions. And these are like the best kind, right? What we find is that, obviously there are many drugs out there that can be toxic over the long term. Most, if not all, create some sort of a side effect. And there have been some studies done and showing that some herbs have the ability to protect the body from the toxic effect of some drugs. For example, Cuba berries can protect the kidneys from nephrotoxicity, so that'd be the nephrons of the kidneys, caused by gentamicin. Milk thistle, of course, is like an amazing hepatoprotective herb and has been shown to really protect the liver from, say, damage from excessive amounts of acetaminophen, right? Alongside many other drugs that can be hard on the liver. So we do find that some herbs can actually be very protective of the organs from what can be damaging side effects of, strong drugs like gentamicin, but also what we think of as like a mild drug like acetaminophen, right? That's just over the counter, but in excessive doses can be, pretty detrimental to the body. Then we get into the other category that I think of as, contraindications. And this is where, we really need to be aware as herbalists, which is basically that the herb will interfere with the drug in some way that, in some negative way, right? So a big example here is with St. John's wort, right? And how St. John's wort can potentially interact with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRI type antidepressants. It could potentially lead to serotonin syndrome, right? Like the mechanism of which St. John's wort acts directly creates a major problem, or can create a major problem in people that might be taking that class of drugs. And one of the main ways, there's a couple ways that we see contraindications happen with herbs. So one of these kind of subcategories, I would say, is metabolism, right? So if we're thinking about the way drugs work, we tend to think of it in terms of their pharmacokinetics and their pharmacodynamics, right? How is that drug absorbed, distributed, transformed, circulated, which is like pharmacokinetics. How does it move through the body? And then the pharmacodynamics is, when that drug gets to its binding site, what is the effect, right? What is that drug changing, shifting? How is it adjusting our physiology, our biochemistry to bring about a particular effect? And then after that, there's more pharmacokinetics in terms of how is that drug then cleared from the body? How is its waste products, or how is it further metabolized? And then how is it excreted from the body? So many herbs can affect this process of drug metabolism. And what we see in some cases is that sometimes herbs can speed up the metabolism of a drug, making it decrease its levels in the bloodstream, or it can slow it down, essentially prolonging the effect of that drug. So typically they're affecting the pharmacokinetics of the drug. And these are the really, really important types of interactions to be aware of, especially when we're talking about drugs that have what are referred to as a narrow therapeutic index. That means that this drug has to stay in a very narrow window of blood levels in order for it to be effective. If it drops below that, the drug's not going to do its job. If it goes above that, it can be harmful, right? It can cause problems. And a really common drug that tends to have a narrow therapeutic index is warfarin, right? A lot of people take warfarin for cardiovascular issues and things like that. It's a very common drug, and we need to be aware of that. And once again, we see St. John's wort is a big one here with drug metabolism, because St. John's wort, we all think of it as like this puncture wound herb or an antidepressive herb, but the thing that commonly gets overlooked with St. John's wort is this is a liver plant, right? St. John's wort is having a very profound effect on the liver, specifically a process that is referred to as phase 1 liver detoxification. And there's a whole kind of complex of enzymes that are referred to as cytochrome P450. And these are basically detoxification pathways that transform, metabolize, break down things in the body that then prepares them for phase 2 liver detoxification, which actually gets them out of the body. St. John's wort, through its effects on cytochrome P450 pathways, oftentimes reduces the blood levels of a drug, rendering it less effective. So if someone's taking a drug for something really, really serious, and they need to have a certain blood level of it, otherwise, their health is severely impacted, and they start taking St. John's wort, it's going to reduce that efficacy. In other instances, it can actually increase plasma levels of the drug, which again can cause further issues. So metabolism, oftentimes these are going to be herbs that are operating through the liver. It is possible elsewhere in the body, but the liver is really the primary organ that is responsible for metabolizing those waste products. Now, the other part of contraindications that we see between herbs and drugs that can happen is herbs that affect absorption. So we've got, the metabolism side once the thing enters the body, but then we have herbs that can affect how well a drug is absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract. So we see, again, either an herb can enhance absorption, or it can decrease or 100% prevent absorption. So an interesting example of this would be prickly ash, or Xanthoxylum claviherculitis, is a really pungent, aromatic, diffusive, circulatory stimulant. really useful for like nerve pain, peripheral circulation deficiency, and things like that. But it's a GI stimulant, right? It really stimulates and enhances absorption of things in general. Also, we see this with a lot of citrus fruits, right? Enhance absorption. So if your body, if your doctor is given a drug that it needs to be absorbed at a certain rate, in order for it to be effective, and then you introduce something like prickly ash, and all of a sudden that drug's being absorbed way more rapidly, this can affect the plasma levels of that drug and potentially lead to issues. The other side of this, we have our herbs that contain a high level of mucilaginous polysaccharides, or demulcents, right? Slippery elm, marshmallow, things like that. Well, those mucilaginous polysaccharides can really prevent absorption of certain, not just drugs, but nutrients and minerals and things like that. So typically if you're drinking like slippery elm gruel or marshmallow, thick mucilaginous marshmallow decoction, to treat dryness, constitutional dryness, etc., you usually need to make sure you take those separately from medications because it will impact their absorption. Tannins, tannin-rich herbs, oak bark, witch hazel, lady's mantle, things that are really astringent can also affect absorption. Especially we see that with minerals, but tannins also precipitate alkaloids. So there is potential for interactions between tannin-rich herbs and alkaloidal medications, or even other alkaloidal herbs. So these are some of the ways that I tend to kind of think about herb-drug interactions. And they're, like I said, they're not all bad. Some of these interactions can be really good. So I think it comes down to the point of, right, herb-drug interactions, fact, fiction, or somewhere in between. I would say that it's somewhere in between. Like, herb-drug interactions happen, for sure. That is a fact, right? That some herbs interact with some drugs. So that is a fact. I think the fiction comes in where I see sometimes people, this is very common more with MDs that maybe usually aren't very aware of herbal medicines. They don't know how herbal medicines work. And so they just take the safe route and say, if you're on medications, just don't take herbs, don't take supplements for fear of interactions. And I think this is the most conservative approach. And I think it's due because they want to protect their patients, right? It's not because like herbs are evil or anything like that. I think it's more the doctors just want to make sure their patients are safe, which I really respect. And I think it's good, but it is also a very conservative approach. Not all herbal medicines have negative interactions with drugs. And the truth is that serious herb-drug interactions are really rare. Like, there is not very many well-documented severe interactions between herbal medicines and prescription drugs. I'm not saying they don't exist, right? I mean, that would be silly if I said they don't exist, because there have been documented cases, but really serious ones are pretty uncommon. And what we see is way more common is drug-drug interactions, right? This is really overlooked a lot of the time. And drug-drug interactions tend to be significantly more severe because, let's face it, our plants aren't as strong as drugs. They're just not. They have much more biochemical complexity than isolated, singular, targeted, silver bullet kind of drugs, right? But they're not nearly as concentrated as drugs are, and therefore, most herbs in that way are significantly milder in their effects than prescription drugs. And a lot of drugs are really strong in their effects, and too strong more often than not for our herbs to really cause a lot of problems, right? So what are some of the issues that we see with herb-drug interactions, right? And this is kind of like some of the fiction part that I feel like is important to clear up just so you are aware of it. So many herb-drug interactions are theoretical. Okay, so sometimes you'll see like this herb interacts with this drug based on this research or whatever. But if you look at the research, it's actually a theoretical interaction. It's not like, oh, we've got 100 documented cases of this person only taking this drug and this person introducing this herb and there was an adverse interaction and it happened for all 100 people, right? That's very, very rare that we see research like that. Most of the time it's theoretical. This drug relaxes the central nervous system. This herb relaxes the central nervous system. Theoretically, though, since they do the same thing, there will be a bit of an additive or a synergistic interaction there, right? Which makes sense. But I think it's really important to remember that many herb-drug interactions documented are theoretical. And I think it's very important in like monograph listings of herbs that it clearly states that, right? Not that this herb interacts with this drug, but this herb may theoretically interact with this drug due to similar pharmacological mechanisms or things like that. So this is very, very common, the theoretical interactions. One other important issue here is that a lot of herb-drug interactions are based on research done on isolated constituents in plants. Possibly on an isolated constituent in a plant given in much larger doses than you would get if you're just taking the whole plant, right? Whether that's the whole plant in a capsule or as an infusion or decoction or tincture. Sometimes research is done on singular compounds and they're giving like way higher amounts than you would ever get just taking, the normal kinds of extracts that people that use herbs are taking. So there's a number, so that's one issue with the isolated chemical research is amount, how much is being given. The other aspect of this is that isolated constituents from plants work differently than the whole plant. Like there's a synergy, there's a biochemical synergy that happens when you take a whole plant where different compounds in the plant are likely affecting the absorption, the metabolism, the excretion, even biochemical transformation happening and interactions happening within the body that just is not taken into account in isolated constituent research. So I think this is a really important thing is that we're checking like, oh, is this interaction based off of the whole plant or is it based off of an isolated constituent from that plant? And then how much of it is being given? Okay, so that's kind of issue number 2 I wanted to note. And issue number 3 is case reports. Case reports of interactions can very easily be skewed. It can be really easy to just say, oh, they took this herb and this interaction happened. But it's a little more complicated than that, right? We got to look at, what other medications is that person taking? Are there other contributing factors that are not being taken into account? Was the herb being documented as being taken actually the herb being taken? Like we need to take that tincture or capsule or supplement and make sure that that actually is the herb that's there. Or was it a single herb? Was it in a formula? Was there a bunch of other supplements in there? And this is important because there's many cases of adulteration that happen in the herbal products industry. One that comes to mind is colt's foot, right? Tussilago farfara. There's been documented case reports of not necessarily herb-drug interaction, but hepatotoxicity from Tussilago or colt's foot due to pyrrolizidine alkaloids. But then they check the product taken or the herb taken, and it turns out that it was adulterated with petasites, butterbur, which is like way higher in pyrrolizidine alkaloids than colt's foot. So these are things that we have to take into account when we're looking at case reports of herb-drug interactions, is that there can be a lot of complexity there that I think needs to be taken into account. So with that said, there are definitely herb-drug interactions that do occur, some positive and some negative. So I think boiling it down here, fact, fiction, or somewhere in between? It's somewhere in between, right? I mean, it's a fact that herb-drug interactions happen. It's a fiction that they happen all the time and that all herbs interact with all drugs. It's not quite that straightforward. So when we're really getting down to it, for you as an herbalist that is working with people, seeing clients, doing clinical work, you have to know about this stuff, right? You have to be aware, you have to be diligent. And here's what I would recommend that you do if you are working with people that are taking prescription drugs. First of all, you need to get a list of everything they're taking, right? You need to know not just what they're taking, you need to know when they started taking it, how long they've been taking that drug, what they're taking that drug for. This is an important question because sometimes people, it's very common for people to get prescribed antidepressants for migraines. So you might, if you just get a list of drugs and you're looking it up and you're like, oh, it's an antidepressant, you might just assume that that person has depression, but they might actually have been prescribed it for something like migraines. So you need to know why they were prescribed that. You need to know how frequently they take that drug, at what dosage they take that drug. This is very, very important information to gather from your clients. You got to know what they're taking, how long, how often, how much. And then you have to do your research. I think this is our responsibility as herbalists that are working with the modern client. You have to look up every single medication that they're taking. You have to have an understanding of what it's doing pharmacologically, what it's used for. You need to know like how it's excreted. Like, does it have a prolonged half-life? Does it have a narrow therapeutic index? You need to know the side effects of that drug. That's a big one. It's really common for a list of people's primary complaints to kind of correspond pretty directly with the side effects of the medications they're taking, which can sometimes be quite the eye-opener for people. So you need to know their side effects. Basically, you need to know what the drug's doing in their body. And you have to do this with every drug that they're taking. And yes, this can be very time consuming, but this is just part of our responsibility of making sure we're being safe in our approach to herbal medicine. And then from there, the way I tend to approach it with all that information, I'll put together my protocol, right? I'll put together, okay, here's the herbs that I want them to take. In an ideal situation, these are all the herbs I want them to take. Then I go and I look all of those herbs up to make sure they don't have any interactions with any of those medications that they're on. And honestly, for the most part, you don't really find too much most of the time. If you're working with, the mild to moderately strong herbs that are most commonly used by clinical herbalists, right? You're not like trying to give them gelsemium or datura or belladonna or, these really, really strong, like what we think of as more low dose herbs. If you're giving them the super safe, gentle herbs that most people use, for the most part, you're going to be okay. But you can't just assume that, right? You have to do your diligence and you got to look everything up. So some resources for doing this that I really like, that I've used a lot over the years. My main textbook for this when I did, because we had a whole series of herb-drug interaction classes when I was at university studying herbal medicine. Our main textbook for this was by Francis Brinker called Herb Contraindications and Drug Interactions. I highly recommend you get the most recent edition of that book. It is a little bit of an investment, but worth it. There's Stockley's Herbal Medicine Interactions that you can usually find copies of that online as PDFs for free. The PDFs are kind of handy because you can search in there. So that's useful. There's Herb, Nutrient, and Drug Interactions by Mitchell Stargrove, Jonathan Treasure, and Dwight McKee. Also, many of these books tend to be a little expensive, but if you're in clinical practice, you need to have some references. There's also the American Herbal Products Association's Botanical Safety Handbook. That's from APA. That can be a really useful reference to have around. And then I really like the Herbal Safety, the Essential Guide to Herbal Safety by Mills and Bone. So that's another really good reference for you. I'll put all those books in the description below, so that you all can have, just have them written down for you, so you don't have to rewind and rewatch to write it down. Also, having a copy of a PDR is really good. Physician's desk reference is always good. And I would also say that I don't generally recommend Googling it too much, right? Like, you want to make sure that you are referencing reliable sources for this information. People that have really scoured the research, know how to sort through it, sort through fact from fiction, good research from bad research. You want to use trustworthy sources. So I recommend these resources as good, solid, reliable information for this. Googling it, who knows what you're going to come up with, right? And there's some online herb drug interaction checkers, and I just don't know how much I trust those, right? Sometimes people go on like WebMD for stuff like this, but is WebMD really have accurate herb information? Yeah, it's pretty conservative, right? So I think it's good to go to the sources of people that really understand herbs and really understand how the drugs work and understand how to read research and can really do that kind of, in a way, do the hard work for us. So we just got good, quick referenceable materials. So final thoughts, herb-drug interactions. So I'd say it's somewhere in between fact and fiction, There's factual components to it. There's fictitious parts of it. I think there are definitely legitimate concerns that you need to be aware of. But there's also a lot of fear-mongering out there, and people that can kind of make it seem like there's more to be afraid of than there actually is. And again, I think it's usually out of probably good intentions, wanting to keep people safe. But I think there's unfortunately a lot of ignorance on the topic. And I think it can make people excessively worried and anxious, to even paranoid, to even working with people on prescription drugs. So in the end, be aware, be cautious, be smart, but don't be paranoid, right? Like, work with people. There are so few serious cases of serious herb-drug interactions in actual people that I think, again, you have to be aware of it. You have to be cautious, but don't be too freaked out about it. If you do your diligence, if you do your research and put the time and effort needed to just make sure that the herbs you're giving someone are going to be safe, you're going to be just fine. So you want to be responsible, be integral, be honest, and be willing to put the work in to make sure you're keeping your clients safe. So thanks so much for joining me here in this episode. Hopefully you learned something good. I think this is a really important topic to talk about. Like I said, I get this question all the time, so I wanted to take a little bit of time to share my thoughts on this subject with the herbal community. Thanks so much for making it to the end of this video. It does really help out. Support the channel, whether you're listening to it on the podcast, YouTube, wherever you are. Really, really appreciate it. If you want to support, do something simple to support the channel, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, leave a good review on the podcast on YouTube. It really does help more than you might know to support our channel here, so we can continue to provide good quality free information to the herbal community. So thanks so much for joining me here, and until the next one, take care and be well.